Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to another layout design video. This design is for an HO scale layout in part of the client's basement, and here is the site shown on the screen. The main area for the railroad is approximately 23 feet by 12, widening to about 15 feet at this end. Obviously I can't use this area down here because it has to be left open as a walkway. Door A leads to the client's workshop, and here we have a generous sized mechanical room. This plan isn't quite right. Opening B leads to a closet, and then the mechanical room is behind it. The windows in the corners are high up and they can be blocked, so they're not really relevant to the railroad. Now, this client had been attempting to design a layout in this space for some time, and the problem was that he wanted to get a lot more railroad into the space than the space really allowed for. His centerpiece scene was to be a large passenger terminal, and since his primary interest is in running full-length passenger trains, he does need big curves. And as anyone familiar with railroad designs would tell you, curves eat up a lot more space than you might at first believe. Anyway, as with always on my layout designs, I started by drawing in possible layout footprints. This is the only sensible footprint that allows for walk-in entry with no complicated swing gates or duck unders. Just a simple folded dog bone wrapped around three sides of the room, leaving access in between the two end lobes. The client and I had already talked about blocking the opening at this point and putting a new door into the mechanical room. And actually it looks like this opening might be beneficial, giving an easier way of accessing the back of this wide benchwork here. We did try various other footprints. Here's one with a stub terminal instead of a through terminal, which I thought might be a better solution, but really it doesn't fit the shape of the room very well. The throat point work in this area is going to just expand and use up everything, and we really don't have enough length, even going to a minimum width aisle around the end. So we abandoned that fairly quickly. Here's another variation going back to the previous footprint, where we talked about the possibility of having two routes through the passenger terminal, one that joins all the levels, and another route that just stays on the upper deck, crossing over the entry on a lift bridge. The turnouts for the staging yard can be on the bridge to save length, allowing the trains to be staged starting right at the very end of the fixed benchwork. Now, the client had already considered the possibility of having a fixed section across the entry on the upper deck only, performing a nod under, with the lower levels conforming to the original walk-in shape. And I thought this might have some merit in managing to get the signature scene into the middle of the room where it can be viewed from both sides. Here's my first attempt at doing that, and although this one looks like you might have an interesting junction at this point, it's going to end up extending a lot further than it looks like on the plan, even with custom turnouts and crossings, and it's probably going to end up not fitting. Here is another version where we tried using the diagonal of the room to improve the length of the passenger terminal, and one of the helixes can be under and behind it in this corner like this. Here's another variation of that, where instead of having the blob by the door, we put it in the opposite corner with a diagonal aisle through the center. And actually we're thinking that this version did have some promise, but at this point the client mentioned that he could move this door further to the south if he needed to, because there was still a few more feet before he got to the furnace. And he asked, would it help if we put one of the helixes in this area in the corner of the mechanical room? So here is the plan drawn, just to make sure I had interpreted him correctly. And he said, yes, that is indeed where he thought it might work, but really it doesn't gain us anything, because we'd still need the second helix at the other end of the plan, and freeing up this space in this corner doesn't really give us anything. Here is a similar viewing showing what the lower levels would have looked like on this same plan, keeping the 3-foot walk-in access, just having a nod under the upper deck. At this point I asked him what the space in this corner was used for, and asked him if we could do something like this. It allows the visible main line to use this entire end of the old mechanical room and put the second lobe in the middle of the room, about where it was, but with a much longer visible main line. He wrote back and said that there was piping and a water heater in this area, so we'd have to slant the benchwork. These are the tentative dimensions that he gave me, and as this plan shows, it still works perfectly adequately with this corner cut back. Now here is a comparison to the very first footprint that I drew, and we can see that it basically has a lot in common. It's pretty much the same design, but we have all this extra length of visible main line, just by incorporating a few extra square feet in the mechanical room. Now, although the dimensions in this area did change slightly as he measured the room more accurately, we now have our final footprint for the railroad. Here is basically the same drawing, but with the benchwork adjusted in this area, gaining as much space as possible before the furnace. We felt it was worth maximizing the width here, because as we can see, the reverse curve in this area is a little bit sharper than what he wanted for his running his passenger trains on. And those extra few inches allow us to keep a minimum 36-inch radius for his main passenger train scene. Now that we had determined the optimum footprint for the railroad, I had a much longer discussion with the client, and it came out that he wasn't really sold on the idea of the double-track continuous run looping through all three decks of the railroad up from staging to the passenger terminal and back down again. He said he would much rather have three separate scenes on the three levels with just a single helix connecting them, with most of the trains staying on their respective levels most of the time and just switching them up occasionally. And this is something that I hadn't really thought of before, but actually the single helix does actually make the plan a lot easier. Here is another view of the upper deck. It shows how I was able to now get a 36-inch radius, still with a sufficient length straight between the reverse curves. And with the client's suggestion of keeping the three layouts more or less independent just with a single helix, I wanted to put staging on all three levels. Now the obvious place to do that is where the track runs through the mechanical room. Note he's not rebuilding the wall between the two areas, so this benchwork here is now accessible from both sides. We can have a backdrop down the middle with the staging yard behind it accessible from the mechanical room, and all the visible portions of the railroad accessed from the front. Now by the time we've finished developing the passenger terminal with all its auxiliary trackage, it's likely that we're going to end up with a very high track density on this upper deck. So I wanted to keep it minimal on the lower levels. Here is the middle level, and this is where his freight yard is going to go, although we decided to keep it very much minimal. It's not meant to be a division point or anything like that. It is just a small local yard serving a few nearby industries. There's a possible site on the peninsula for a small industrial suburb. There could be a few industries around the back of the yard, and also there is the industrial area on the upper deck. Let's go back to that. We'd previously put in a short industrial branch on the peninsula on the upper deck, just to give an opportunity for local freight switching on this deck with a contrast to all the passenger trains that are the main feature. And with later discussion we decided to do this as a beer line theme, as is very appropriate for the Millwall Quay area, which the main station was to represent. So going back to the middle level, you can see that once again I have a 6-track staging yard directly under the upper level one. And here is the lower level with a much larger staging yard filling a good portion of the level, because this is where most of his trains will be staged. And this deck will have just a couple of scenic scenes with no local switching, since it's a little on the low side for comfortable operation. However, with a multi-deck layout, it's also generally the only area where one can incorporate deep valleys without getting in the way of the scenes below. Now that we have the contents of the three decks pretty much determined, it's time to start working on the actual track locations and filling in all the details. As per normal, I started with the most complicated areas, in this case the upper deck. In this view I have all the yard ladders at both ends of the main passenger terminal and all the subsidiary areas filled in with actual turnouts. With the room being rather short for a major passenger terminal, I have of course had to use a large number of curved turnouts. I did put one number 8 single slip at this end, Now, a single slip turnout does help to give the appearance of a large city terminal without adding too much to the complexity. And it's an item that I sell through my website because I don't think anybody else makes a number 8 single slip. At this end, I did also toy with putting a couple of slip turnouts in there, but I felt it worked better using opposite hand turnouts on the crossovers to allow the curve to continue through the whole area. That way it fitted a whole lot better. It does mean that it's rather difficult to figure out which tracks are which, so I suggested to the client that he ballast the mainline tracks with a different colour ballast, making it obvious which track is which. And different colours of ballast are fairly common on the prototype anyway. Now, it's generally not a good idea to try switching long passenger cars on minimum radius curves, so this end of the terminal will be difficult to switch. However, if the client arranges to switch all his head-end traffic on the westbound trains and switch sleeping and dining cars from the rear of eastbound trains, then this arrangement will work quite well and we can avoid switching on the sharp curves at the far end of the station. And since all the subsidiary areas, the post office, the express agency and the commissary are all at this end, it makes it a lot easier. And yes, I know on a real passenger terminal trains will be switched in both directions, but this is just a compromise necessary by the limited length in the room. I haven't yet connected up the engine terminal at this point. I wanted to make sure that everything else was going to work first. And also note there's a bit of a break here. That's because the approach to the beer line was adjusted, and at this point there's no sense in redrawing all of this trackage. At the moment it's just a placeholder. And when I worked out the grade profile, I found it was necessary for the industrial trackage to be under the main lines instead of over them. And actually it's probably more prototypical that way anyway, because many major cities throughout the country have had their main lines raised above street level to reduce congestion in the city, whereas the local lines often remain as they were. So I felt this would be a good opportunity for a city viaduct over a complex of roads, industries and alleyways. And the client also liked that idea. Another thing we can see in this version is that I have extended the staging tracks. Originally my intention was to have the turnouts in this area behind the backdrop, but since that's the point that's most difficult to reach, I felt it'd be better to extend them and have them accessible via a removable piece of scenery. It also means that they are now plenty long enough instead of being of questionable length. It's always best to have staging tracks longer than you need them. That way you don't have to be worried about parking the train accurately in exactly the right place. You have a couple of feet of leeway either way. Here is the next version of the upper deck. This one has the engine terminal all filled in properly. It has everything one could possibly want in that area. The client also asked for a separate diesel shop, which I've managed to incorporate. I wasn't sure whether we'd have enough vertical clearance to extend the tracks over the lower level hidden loop. The building can continue over it, but 2 of the 3 tracks might have to stop short, in which case it's not a big problem because there's still plenty of room for parking locomotives outside the structure. And when the layout is built, it might even be possible to extend them over the lower track using thin benchwork, as long as the inspection pit stops short. Moving on to the middle level, here it is with all the track filled in properly. The industrial area is probably still going to change. One thing I've shown is how a couple of spurs can possibly extend through the backdrop for greater capacity, if the client wants to. At this point, the client mentioned that he was concerned about the lack of open scenery on this space, and it does look like there is indeed too much track until I eliminate the hidden track. Here is a view with the hidden track eliminated. As you can see, there is a lot more open space on this view with only the visible track shown. And as soon as I sent this out to the client, he was very happy with the effect. Another thing I've shown on this version is the possibility of extending this river all the way around the end of the peninsula, running along the main line on both sides. Because trains running alongside water always tend to look good, especially if the water is in front and you have the option of looking over the water towards the tracks. There are 3 of the shorter Walther's truss bridges on this level because the client acquired 3 of them from his local club that no longer wanted them. He said the club felt that they didn't have sufficient clearance for their modern layout with double stacks on it, but they're perfectly fine for a steam era railroad. Here is the lower deck with all the track filled in. can see the huge staging yard. It's always worth fitting as much staging as you possibly can into a railroad, because almost invariably you'll acquire more locomotives and cars than you intended, and you will run out of staging anyway. Now, I've included a lot of short spurs at both ends of the staging yard for spare locomotives. The client had told me that he had a lot of Pico number 6 and a few number 5 turnouts in stock, and these turnouts are great for staging yards. And since they have a reliable over-center spring, those turnouts that give access to the spare locomotive tracks don't even need expensive switch machines on them. The client can simply reach in and flip them with his fingers. So all these spare locomotive tracks at both ends are effectively almost free. Now, as I already mentioned, the lower deck is a good place for deep river valleys that can't easily be incorporated on the upper decks. The client had something in mind for this area with 2 separate main lines through it, so I started on the tight reverse curve through the peninsula. And something that I remembered from a model railroad magazine back in the early 80s is a scene that really captivated me then, and it still does today every time I see it. And that is a scene from a very well-known model railroad. Here is the scene in question. Older viewers may remember this. It is, of course, the Willsboro Bay scene on a very large club layout located in a building, the name of which I can never pronounce. Now, although this scene is bent around a very large, graceful curve, probably in the region of 10 or 12 foot radius, we have to bend it around a minimum radius reverse curve. And actually, it's one of those scenes that can easily do that without losing any of its flavour. I suggested this to the client, and he immediately jumped at the idea. He was really excited about building this scene. So here is my version of it. The distance between the 2 tunnel portals here and here is about the same as it is on the big club layout, but the curves are of course much sharper. And since we're not trying to represent an actual scene, we can take modeler's license, add a lot more interest. I've added this additional short rock bore tunnel and some bridges. A small bridge over this side, a medium bridge. This one is sized for the Walthers Deck Truss Bridge. I can't remember the part number, but it's a very nice looking bridge. And then a short curved trestle. I've shown the water level down at 12 inches below track level, so 8 inches off the floor. And then the other side of the peninsula is a separate scene with a single long trestle over a deep valley, which is something else the client was hoping for. In later plans, I dropped these elevations lower, 3 inches for the stream at this point, and 6 inches for the Willsboro Bay scene, although we have renamed the scene. Now, at this point, the client described to me what he had envisioned for this side of the railroad. He mentioned a flag stop depot that was between 2 tracks, and he also mentioned several industries that were in the area. So I tried to imagine what he was talking about and come up with something that might fit the bill. This is what I drew, and yes, I know it goes against what I said about the level being too low for switching operations, but I thought that was what the client was asking for, and I figured that a swivel office chair on its lowest setting might possibly work for this area, since it's bent around the end of an aisle, and by putting the chair in the middle, one could just swivel to get to both ends of the switching area. Anyway, it turns out this was not what the client was after, so we ended up having an hour-long phone call, and by the end of that it seemed like we were both on the same page. Here is what I later drew, and it turns out this was exactly what the client was looking for. The flag stop is no longer between 2 tracks, for reasons that I discussed with him. It's a lot easier to have the driveway serving it disappear off the front of the fascia into the aisle than it is to try to disguise it against the backdrop. The client mentioned that he had a lot of small town Main Street buildings, so there's 2 places where he can use up some of those. One street here crosses both tracks at grade, allowing for 2 grade crossings. The other one just cuts across the corner of the benchwork, allowing an uninterrupted front view of some of his favourite buildings. The Millbank Depot is a kit that he found, and that's the actual size of it. We decided that instead of having a switching location here, we would make the spur derelict with the turnout removed. He asked for a church on a hillside. Here we can get away with it being in the background because it could be surrounded by trees, where it's impossible from any normal viewing angle to see that there is no road access or parking area at the other side of it. and also I've included a small creek with two small bridges halfway between the tunnels. And we've managed to keep the different track elevations along this side. They are both at the same elevation where they cross Main Street, making the grade crossing simpler. Then the near track drops down below to give the different elevations the client wanted, and then immediately comes back up again on the hidden portion in the staging area. Another thing that the client has suggested during the phone call was that I draw this as a fall scene, as I have in several other plans, because he wanted to see what it would look like. He might not go with the fall colours when he builds it, but he has options, and here you can see what it might look like. So at this point we decided to call this level done. Here is the middle level with the scenery completed. I've modified the industrial area somewhat, but otherwise the trackage is much the way it was. The two long tracks that go through the backdrop, we decided to conserve any industry the client wants it to, and it doesn't even have to be the same industry in every operating session. There's no reason why it can't be a paper mill one day and a cement works the next. And in every operating session he can just drop off whatever cars are appropriate for that type of industry. Other industries he asked for at this time were stock pens, because he had a lot of cattle cars, and he wanted a grain elevator and feed mill complex. So those are in that corner. A rip track is always a very useful industry. Not only can it accept any type of car without requiring a lot of big structures, but it's also a very convenient spot for parking bad order cars until you have time to work on them. Although there is plenty of room to add more industries, I wanted to avoid that temptation because I didn't want to overpower the capacity of the yard. I did, however, incorporate a couple of wrinkles. In this area, there is a single spur that faces backwards, requiring the operator to think ahead and ensure that the cars are on the other end of the locomotive when he switches it, because there's no run round in this area. The run round would have to be done in the yard. And at the other end, I've put one industry on the opposite side of the main line. I've selected a pulpwood loading spur because it is appropriate for a narrow space and doesn't require any tall structures. At this point I went back to working on the upper deck, and we can see here that I have filled in the beer yard. Although this is not my first attempt, it certainly wasn't my last. At this point I felt that it was getting fairly close to being both workable and interesting, although it still has some problems. A lot of the inspiration for this area came from a couple of plans from Model Railroader that the client dug up and sent me. Until I studied those, I had never considered a cullet track or even an area for loading spent grains. I don't drink beer and I don't know a lot about the beer making process. Now, although I've drawn this in such a way that it looks like the branch line continues, obviously on the model his local freight has to terminate here. So I needed to make sure that I provided somewhere to stash the excess cars while you're switching. At first I thought about the possibility of about a 3 or 4 track stub-ended yard just running off the benchwork in this corner, but I didn't like that idea and it just seemed to look like too much track. So I have added a third track down the middle in the run round area. Ideally I'd have liked to have put a fourth track in there. That way you can arrive on one of the middle tracks and make up the outbound train on the other middle track, still leaving the 2 outer ones for access. On this plan there's only room for 3, so it just makes switching a little more difficult. But providing the client can resist the temptation to run trains that are too long, it shouldn't be a problem. Here is the final version of the upper deck. Other than filling in all the structures and scenery, most of the changes on this level are around the beer line area. I'd like to point out a few things here. I've included a few industries that are not beer related, just to add variety. I suggested a cement transfer in this area. The Walthers Medusa cement is an ideal structure for it. Also, being a fairly small but tall structure, and placing it in front of the main line helps to break up the long continuous curve. And I've done the same in the other corner with the small brewery. The intention is that most of the trackage here serves a single large brewery, and there's a few other industries and a smaller brewery beside it. Now this, I think, is a good spot to use the Walthers Milwaukee Brewery kit, which is a fairly tall structure and again breaks up the mainline curve. And in both cases they don't cause a problem with access because, well, in this corner there's nothing really to reach behind it, and in this corner it's at the widest point, so it's more convenient to reach from the end or from the side anyway. This additional spur that runs off the benchwork edge here originally was going to be a dummy, but I figured I may as well figure out how an actual turnout will fit. I pointed out to the client that it could easily be modelled as a disused spur with the turnout removed if he wants to, but there's no reason why it can't be an extra industry to switch if he so desires. It's going to be years before he builds a top deck anyway, so this area may well change. Another thing to note is that the structures in the middle of the railroad prevent an easy view from one side to the other, once again disguising the fact that the mainline viaduct wraps around more than a 180-degree curve. And I've used raised walkways over the roads connecting adjacent structures, in this point used to assist in the view block, and at this point used to disguise the awkward area where the road hits the backdrop. The rest of the area has been filled in with an idea to providing as much interest and variety as possible. Another change I made at this point was to reduce the length of the train shed. The client has 4 of them in his possession and he wanted to use all 4 of them, and that's what I had drawn in earlier plans. I recommended that he shorten the train shed, use parts of a 3rd kit to lengthen 2 others, and then resell the 4th one. That gives more open track at both ends, allowing much easier access to his trains. Anyway, that just about completes this layout design. Before I sign off, let me show you some clean versions of the various levels. Here is the upper deck with all the annotations removed. Feel free to pause it if you'd like a longer look. Here is the middle deck. Again, feel free to pause. And here is the lower deck. One interesting lesson that came about from doing this layout design was how a relatively small additional land grab could make such a huge difference to the plan. The client had been unsuccessfully trying to cram the kind of layout he wanted into the space he had available for a long time before hiring me, and the first few designs that I drew really didn't excite him either, and it wasn't until we talked about annexing about an extra 50 or 60 square feet from the closet and mechanical room that things started to really take off, making a huge improvement, completely disproportionate to the relatively small additional space that we were able to find. So I guess the lesson to be taken away from that is to always think outside the box and consider all the options. The client was so excited by the improvements to the railroad facilitated by this extra land grab that by the time I had finished the design, he had already demolished the interior wall and put the new door in. And something else I think worth mentioning is that this railroad really does use the entire cubic volume of the room, not just regarding the layout room as a 2-dimensional shape on the screen. On the lower level, the scenery drops to within 3 inches of the floor, while on the upper deck, the passenger station had to be moved off-centre in the room because the top of the tower extends above the air ducts that pass through the middle of the room. I just thought that was worth throwing out there. I am going to sign off here. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you back next week. So until then, thanks for watching, and bye for now.